Hello and welcome back to Hydroponics Daily, your go-to podcast for everything soilless cultivation. I'm your host, Dr. Russell Sharp. I'm the founder of Utrema Limited. We make interesting fertilizers, novel biostimulants, and organic biopesticides, including gold leaf, or as it's called in the UK, liquid gold. And that's important because we're going to be talking about EC meters today, and I'm going to be mentioning gold leaf a few times on this podcast about EC meters. Now, if you listen to the first 100 episodes of this podcast, you'll know I'm a big fan of EC meters. They're an invaluable tool that help you estimate the amount of fertilizer in a solution of water. But really, the reason I really love them is that when you have something like cocoa and you've been feeding it, when you should always run off a small amount of solution out the bottom of the sources if you're growing in cocoa or peat or soil, and about 10 to 20%. And if you put an ECP pen in that outflow, that runoff, it tells you how much buildup of fertilizer there's been in the grow media. And if it's too high, then you need to flush more solution through. A lot of people don't flush out runoff, and it's very important. You do need to have some way of getting rid of that runoff as well. Otherwise, it will build up and you won't get as good a crop, nowhere near as good a crop. And even houseplants as well. That's the problem with houseplants, is you feed them for years and years and years, and this salt level builds up. You stick an EC pen in there and you go, oh my God, what have I done? And then you flush them all out, and you'll find 2 weeks later, all your houseplants are growing away really well. EC pens are great. However, today we're going to talk about the limitations of EC pens, EC meters, whether they're handheld devices or inline computer controlled. So the first one is EC shows overall iron concentration. So the charged elements, all the dissolved salts combined. It does not identify only nutrients. So it's not just your nutrients, and it can't differentiate between any of the nutrients. So it could be really high in potassium, or really high in magnesium, or really high in sodium. You don't know. It could be a nutrient that's high in one particular, could be a blend, they could all be in the right ratios, or it could be a toxin like sodium. So it could be from unwanted salts or unbalanced salts, and you would never know. So we can't distinguish between them. Sodium, chloride, even arsenic, things like this would all be picked up on an EC pen. The other thing is that EC measurements are temperature dependent, and conductivity changes with temperature. So if the meter lacks automatic temperature compensation, then the readings can be inaccurate. As I said, there's no information about nutrient ratios. So if your plants have absorbed loads of calcium or loads of nitrogen, and you're adding fertilizer in, and you think, oh, I've rebalanced it to the stated EC value, then you still might be deficient in one of the nutrients. You can't tell that. Another limitation is they don't detect pH, and pH affects nutrient availability. So EC only measures the salt concentration, not the acidity or alkalinity, so you need an extra pen to do that. And here is a big one. Organic fertilizers often don't show up well. Many organic nutrients are ionic until broken down by aren't ionic until they're broken down by microbes. So they might be amino acids or proteins or peptides, and until broken down, they won't be picked up. There could be a whole host of other different compounds containing the nutrients. So water may test low for EC, but still be nutrient rich. And so then this is the big problem, is that people get EC charts and they say, oh, I've heard that for this crop, C, then I need this EC value 2000, for example. And that's just not true. The only time you should refer to EC charts blindly is when you're using a bog standard fertilizer that is one of the A and B fertilizers, and it uses the same recipe as the bog standard hydroponic feeds. If you're using anything interesting like an organic fertilizer, do not use an EC chart. And if you're using gold leaf, or as it's called in the UK, liquid gold, don't use an EC chart, because you will massively over-fertilize your crops. And over-fertilizing is worse than under-fertilizing. So don't just go off that EC value. What you can do is add the fertilizer to your water in the ratios recommended by the manufacturer, then take an EC measurement, and then use that measurement as your guide. Don't use the chart off the internet. Don't use what your mate Barry tells you. use the EC value in your water when you put the fertilizer into the recommended value. Okay, so that's really important. So organic fertilizer, anything novel, a fertilizer that's not run of the mill, that's one of the big limitations. Don't just then add them to the level that's stated on all these bog standard charts. Nutrient uptake changes EC unpredictably. So plants remove specific ions while leaving others behind, and EC may look safe when nutrient balance is great. I think I've already covered that. So what are EC good for? EC meters good for? They're good for tracking relative fertilizer strength over time. So once you've got that baseline level, you can then use that as your reference point and try and always maintain that. It helps you avoid salt buildups in hydroponics and in semi-hydroponics, and it's fast and an inexpensive monitoring. I always say, I don't always say, that's a lie. I do always say it, but I didn't come up with it. The person who came up with this, from my eyes, is Professor Bill Davis at Lancaster University. Shout out to Bill. He always used to say to me, change as little as possible in a plant science experiment and measure as much as possible. And if EC is one of these things that you can measure along with pH and monitor it all the time, and you'll never think, oh no, I didn't monitor enough. And the other thing you'll never say is, oh, I didn't take enough pictures of my experiment or my crop. They're things that plant scientists never say. They don't never say, oh, I collected too much data or I measured too many variables. I took far too many photos of my experiment. You'll always come to regret not doing enough of those two things. What you will say is, oh, I made my experiment far too complicated. I changed far too many variables. And then that made the amount of data points I had to collect so much more. And my data was useless because I changed so many variables. So change as little as possible, measure as much as possible, and take as many pictures as possible. Okay, so in summary, EC meters are great, but they do have their limitations, and do not use the measurements on charts unless you're using a bog standard hydroponic fertilizer and not doing anything different from the norm. If you're using organic or an interesting fertilizer like liquid gold or gold leaf in the US or liquid gold in the UK, then always use your reference point. Add it to your particular tap water or RO water, measure it, and then use that as your baseline to work towards. Hope that's been useful and not too complicated for today. I was going to do an episode on how EC meters work, but I think it's quite self-explanatory. They measure the electrical conductivity, the flow of electrons through water medium. And obviously, when you've got more ions, that's easier. They can move faster. All right. Thank you very much for listening. Until tomorrow, that's been Hydroponics Daily. If you found it useful at all, please leave an Apple Podcast review if you listen on an Apple device. If you listening on any other device, do not leave a review because it's worthless. It doesn't help us move up the charts. But if you could check out utrema.co.uk, that would help me spread the word about what we're doing at Utrema, helping reduce the amount of toxins that are entering the food system and our soils and our growing systems. If you struggle to spell Utrema, it's Latin for wasabi. All right. Thank you very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.